name's George Osborne. I'm the chair of the trustees of the British Museum, and you are very, very welcome here at something of a new departure for us. And hopefully it goes so well that we have more of these events, but we haven't committed to that yet. So this is very much a trial, but one I'm absolutely confident will be a great success. And it all sprang from a discussion among the trustees over a period of time, which was, if we're going to have a discussion about this museum and other museums like it, why don't we have it within the walls of the museum rather than outside the museum and pretend it's not happening? And when the museum was first conceived and created by Parliament in 1753, it was itself very controversial. There were plenty of MPs at the time who didn't think that the British state should be taking on the role of running a public museum. And it was the first public museum of its kind in the world. And it wasn't a royal collection like the Louvre. It wasn't a religious collection like the Vatican museums. It was a public collection. And at the time, and until only a few decades ago, it included the British Library. And indeed, although much is made of Hans Sloane, the guy who came up with the idea of the museum, in fact, in the original collection, the library of someone called Henry Cotton was very important too. And he had within that library 2 of the 4 copies of the Magna Carta. And he had donated them to the nation, and they'd all sat in a storage room for several decades. There was a fire that had partly damaged one of the 2 copies, and that was what prompted Parliament at the time to act, to create the British Library, the British Museum, and in order to preserve these great documents for the future. And because it was the Magna Carta, it was felt that Parliament should do it. Fast forward 100 years, and the round reading room was created. Amazing room. Hopefully you've all taken a look at it as you came inside, and created by the great architect Smirke, who designed much of the museum in the 19th century. And as you all know, that was pretty much, I'm not sure it's the most famous library in the world, but it's certainly one of the most famous libraries in the world. And all sorts of intellectual activity has happened in that room over the century and a half since. It's famously where Karl Marx studied and wrote Das Kapital, but it's also where Lenin studied, and Virginia Woolf and George Orwell and Beatrix Potter and all sorts of extraordinary characters. And it has for 25 years been shut, basically. Ever since the millennium and the incredible Norman Foster roof that was put over the Great Court and the decision to move the British Library to St Pancras, that room has been closed. It was open for a period as a temporary exhibition centre, but certainly for the last decade it's been completely closed to the public. And what we're doing today is 2 things. So first of all, we are opening the round reading room to the public. So from today onwards, people who come to visit the British Museum will be able to do what I hope most of you have done, which is gone and had a look at that extraordinary room. Certainly when you go in there, you see it for the first time. I remember having the feeling, I think I've seen this room before somehow in my life, but because it's so famous. So people will be able to go and see that room. And we thought we would mark the occasion, rather than just a kind of ribbon cutting and opening the doors to it, we would have a debate, and we would have a proper argument, an argument in the good old-fashioned sense, a civilized discussion. Because that's what happened in that room. That's what the British Museum was all about when it was first created. And there is lots to discuss about the role of this museum. And to my mind, essentially the collision between the Enlightenment values which surrounded the creation of the museum, the Enlightenment values that were born of the American and the French and the English Enlightenment in the 18th century, and the colonial empires that were associated with those countries. And that is a collision that very much exists today. We're self-confident about having that debate here. I want to thank the Times newspaper, who've been doing this in partnership with us, and really did us proud, for those who saw it, with the spread they had in the magazine on Saturday. And I'm particularly grateful for our extremely distinguished debating panel and Matthew Parris, who is going to chair it for us, and of course is himself a great columnist at the Times newspaper. Matthew, over to you.
Well, good evening. I am, as George Osborne has just pointed out, Matthew Parris, author, broadcaster, columnist for the Times and The Spectator. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the British Museum, where, in partnership with the Times, we're going to be debating who owns the past, the role of the Universal Museum in the future. The recording of the debate will be broadcast on Times Radio on Saturday, July the 13th at 7 p.m. I am the Joe Biden of chairs. I struggle to get up onto the rostrum. I shall probably fall off it going down. I am completely ignorant about most of the things that we'll be talking about this evening, and so I'm going to be relying very heavily on my brilliant panel to carry the discussion. Again, as George says, the British Museum was the world's first universal museum, founded by Sir Hans Sloane in the 1750s, with the Enlightenment ideal to house the greatest cultural artifacts from all over the world under one roof, to promote public understanding of other cultures, and to showcase humanity's fundamental interconnectedness. He stipulated in his will that he wanted the exhibits to be seen by anyone who wanted to see them. But today, the idea of the Universal Museum is under attack. Critics argue that some artifacts were acquired illegally, and that regardless of how cultural heritage was acquired, it should be returned to the communities who believe it is symbolically theirs. Critics also claim that these institutions are inextricably bound up with colonial history, and that it's time for universal museums to confront their past and rethink their role. With me to discuss this, I have four distinguished guests. Mary Beard, one of the UK's best-known classicists. She's Emerita Professor of Classics at Newnham College, Cambridge, the Classics Editor of the TLS, and an internationally best-selling author. She's trustee of the British Museum, but speaking today in her own right. David Olusoga, BAFTA-winning television historian and award-winning author. He is Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester. Munira Mirza, former director of the No. 10 Policy Unit between 2019 and 2022, and before that, Deputy Mayor of London on the Greater London Authority. She's currently CEO of Civic Future, which aims to encourage talented people in the UK to enter public life. There has never been a greater need than that. Rory Stewart is the former Conservative Cabinet Minister and best-selling author. He's senior advisor to the non-profit organisation Give Directly. He's a Yale professor, and he's co-host with Alistair Campbell of the hit podcast, the UK's most popular podcast, The Rest is Politics. The five of us will be talking about the concept of the Universal Museum. We're going to be in conversation until about 7:30 p.m, but then I'm going to be taking your questions. So do start thinking about what you would like to ask the speakers. I shall say very little, but I think it worth pointing out right at the outset three distinctions that I think we ought to bear in mind as we discuss these things, so that we don't just fall into a kind of morass of argument and counter-argument. Firstly, three distinctions. Firstly, the distinction between objects that were plundered or stolen or pillaged on the one hand, and objects that were, in their time, legitimately acquired. Secondly, the distinction between objects that have some particular connection to the place where they come from, and objects that have no particular connection to one place or one people or another. And finally, the distinction between objects that can float around, that can be put in aeroplanes easily, and objects that are attached to other things and have been detached from the other things to which they were attached. I don't suppose Rory would want a section of Hadrian's Wall, which was in his old constituency, to be removed and brought even to the British Museum, let alone sent abroad. Let's start with the idea of a universal museum. And Mary, what do you take to be a universal museum?
Well, you got it absolutely right at the basic level, Matthew. I think it's, at its simplest, it's a museum which collects and displays materials not just from its locality or its own nation, but from across the world, whether those are cultural objects or natural objects. And it juxtaposes different cultures. The BM is one of the great examples, so is the Louvre, so is the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Happily, for our discussion, it's a bit more complicated and interestingly complicated than that. And first of all, the term universal, or it's sometimes called encyclopedic museum, that's a relatively recent term. It's not used even in museological circles much before the 1980s. In fact, it's a product of when those museums became to be criticised, actually. Now, so the name is new, though the idea is not new. The idea goes back to the cabinets of curiosities in the 16th century, where, again, the idea of the world in a single room was the collector's ideal. What that means is that the Universal Museum is absolutely fundamentally not a creation of empire. Now, empire inflects it differently, it changes the ideology, it changes the processes, I'm putting this euphemistically, by which some of those objects are acquired, but empire did not create the Universal Museum. It originated, if anything, as a material encyclopedia. Two more very brief points. One is, it is almost entirely Western, not absolutely entirely. There's a notable equivalent of a Universal Museum assembled by one of the Ashantahini in what is now Ghana in the 19th century, but by and large it's a Western phenomenon. By and large also it's aspirational. You know, you don't ever put the world in a single building. It is partly an ideological fantasy of what the world might look like. And always ideological. Nobody can imagine the world without it being absolutely fundamentally ideological.
Should it be called the British Museum?
I think it is British not because it includes only things from Britain, but it's the British Museum because it's for the British and, as Sloane was very keen to say, for everyone. It's in Britain. And in fact, that kind of, I think, that geographical sort of mismatch in some way in the title is partly what gives it its edge. Is it, you know, it's asking you, what is it to be British? And if you say, coming from a different point of view, look, Britain is a wonderfully hybrid, motley, mixed kind of culture, then in a sense, the British Museum is Britain.
David, Mary says not a creation of empire. Is that right?
I think in a way it is, and in a way it's not. Multiple and many institutions in Britain are influenced and shaped by empire. Our universities, the Church of England was involved in empire in all different ways. So it's not sort of immersed in empire in a way that is unique only to museums. But of course it is shaped by empire. Hans Sloane was deeply connected to empire. He was somebody, much of the wealth that generated the collection that became the British Museum came from his wife's plantations in Jamaica. He himself described himself as a planter, the 18th century word for a slave owner. He collected objects from all over what was the emerging British Empire. He was an investor in the South Seas Company, and this building is full of objects that would not have been accessible to the British had it not been for the empire. So you have a European Enlightenment ideal which predates those phenomena, but like everything else. I mean, I've just travelled from Bristol on a railway line in which investors who'd made their money in the East India Company, in slavery, in compensation at the end of the slavery, helped build. I've just benefited from the infrastructure of empire. So yes and no, but it's not uniquely shaped by empire. Many institutions are.
Does it matter?
Well, I think it matters because we haven't wanted to talk about it. And I think what we're experiencing now is, and the museums are one of the many institutions being called into these discussions, is that we haven't wanted to talk about the history of the British Empire. Museums infamously have used euphemisms in their descriptions, in their catalogues, in their interpretation panels. So I think what we're dealing with now is a backlog of discussions about the colonial connections of multiple British institutions, of conversations that we didn't want to have in the past.
Munira, the Universal Museum.
Well, I agree with David that it's important to look at the Universal Museum in its historic context. But I think it's important to tell the complexity of that story. So as well as a lot of these institutions, the British Museum partly being built out of the proceeds of empire and the transatlantic slave trade, these institutions were also a very radical innovation for their time, because really prior to the 18th century, by and large, with a few exceptions, most of human history is a story of plunder, looting, pillage, countries, empires invading other territories and stealing artworks, and not particularly caring about conserving the cultural heritage, studying the heritage, developing scholarship or museums. That was a very typical, that was the norm throughout most of human history. And something really extraordinary happens in the 18th century, which is that groups of collectors and scholars like Hans Sloane start to look at other cultures and other people differently. And they start to take seriously these cultures and treat them as worthy of study and worthy of value. And in many cases, use their own personal fortunes to build these institutions. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because they're part of a broader intellectual shift, which is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a different way of seeing human difference. It's a way of thinking of other cultures as being part of a shared human experience, the universal human experience. And as part of the Enlightenment, there are all sorts of philosophical debates, discussions that take place over a course of 2 centuries about the natural rights of man. So it's true that museums are partly a product of some of the darker episodes of British history, but they are also contained within them the seeds of what we now call liberal ideas, ideas of equality, of tolerance, of shared understanding across cultural divides. And sometimes I think in the museums profession, museums world, which I've worked in, and I've worked with many museums over the years, I think there is understandably a desire to kind of excavate the past and look at the history. But I think sometimes that radical, revolutionary aspect of museums is hidden from view. And we've started almost to see these institutions as instruments of oppression and subjugation. But in fact, they contain within them, I would argue, the seeds of thinking that then became the abolition movement in Britain, that became the original decolonisation movement. And they are something to be celebrated. And the British Museum is the absolute example of that.
You said at the outset that in history, everybody was invading everybody else, plundering things, stealing things, and that can't be denied. But there is an argument that we aren't like that now, and some things perhaps ought to be returned. Your argument is almost too strong if you're suggesting that nothing should be moved, or are you suggesting that?
No, I'm not an absolutist about it, and I think you could make the case for certain objects. However, some conditions need to be met.
Yes.
So, I think there are examples. For example, the looting, the Nazis looting artifacts, artworks from their Jewish victims. I think it's absolutely right that museums return those. You're able to trace the rightful owner in those cases. I think there is a very good, strong legal arguments for that. It's obviously more complicated the further back in time you go. And legally, lots of these objects in places like the British Museum were taken legally at the time. We've changed the law since then, but they were legal at the time. I would say that in order to return items, you'd have to be confident about the rightful owner. In lots of cases, we do not know the rightful owner. The ownership is contested. So, for example, take the Koh-i-Noor diamond. There are 4 countries that claim ownership over that diamond. It's not an easy puzzle to solve. And you also have to be confident that if the objects are returned, they are looked after properly. And
Isn't that a little bit neo-colonialist? Us telling people...
Well, no, there's a very good example. You know, the German government in the last few years returned a number of objects to Nigeria that were taken during the British expedition to the Kingdom of Benin. And those objects were intended to go into public museums. They actually, by the Nigerian government decided to put them in the private collection of the Oba, who was a descendant of the original Oba at the time. So it's not always the case that those objects are returned to the rightful owner. I'd like to make, just one more kind of philosophical point, I guess, which is cultural objects are a product of a place and a time, a particular place and a time. But they are also products of a wider human experience. And the point of museums is that they are taking objects out of their particular place. They are an artificial venue, they're an artificial space. And every object in every museum around the world came from somewhere else. There are objects in museums in the Middle East, in China, that came from other countries. And we recognize that and we accept that because we know that it's a good thing for cultures and objects to be seen by other cultures, that is a good, positive way of creating empathy and understanding between nations. And therefore, I would guard against the idea that there is a right place for an object where it belongs. And I think, if you believe that everything should be returned back to its original place of creation, you are emptying out museums completely.
Rory, right place for everything where it belongs, or not?
Well, I think one thing that strikes me in this debate, which is, can you all hear me? I'm holding this strange object, is that it's often depends whether or not it's a country that we like and are interested in that's asking for the object back, right? So I think it's probably no accident that we got very excited at the idea of returning the Elgin marbles because we were very interested in ancient Greece. Lots of kind of British schoolboys were forced to learn Greek. We all went off to Greece. We all looked at these objects. And we also believed in Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, and we loved Lord Byron and all this kind of stuff. If, on the other hand, you are Afghanistan, right, you're the Taliban government asking for us to return objects, we may look at it in a different way. And just to develop that a little bit further. It's also a question of what we choose to consider important. So let's say the Afghans were looking for objects to come back, right? What happens if it was the Nuristanis, who are a marginalized group in northeast Afghanistan, looking for some of their woodwork to return? Who would speak for them? Right? People speak for Aboriginal groups in Australia. We have a very, very sophisticated Greek prime minister who makes a really good case, and the Greeks have been making a very good case for 200 years. But I think this is something we need to investigate a little bit more because we're only beginning to scratch the surface of the different kinds of arguments that could come not just from different countries or about different objects, just to develop Munira's point. Again, the Afghans have a good claim on the Koh-i-Noor, but nobody's listening to their claim because, in fact, it was taken from them by Ranjit Singh and dragged over to the Punjab, whence it made its way to Queen Victoria, right? But it's India who's dominating the argument around the Koh-i-Noor. Why? Presumably because India is more prestigious, more powerful, we like India, and the other claimants, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, we're just not so fond of. So there we are.
Do jump in, anybody, if you would like. Mary, I can tell.
I mean, part of the issue is what is pointed to in our title for this discussion, which is who owns the past. And there are many plausible and not stupid answers to that question, but they're in conflict. And with material objects, we're in a much more difficult position than we are with, say, Mozart or Shakespeare or whatever, because everybody can have Shakespeare or Mozart. You can go to Stratford-on-Avon and you can see that they have a particular connection, but they don't own him. Now, one of the basic, fundamental, blindingly obvious points about works of art is that they can only be in one place at one time. And I think that is a central difficulty. And I think that then relates to the question which has been hinted at in what other people have said, which is, are these objects, these great objects, great cultural objects, you could choose the Parthenon marbles, but you could choose many other things, Benin bronzes. Who do they actually belong to?
Munira, can I just a question quickly?
You have to be very quick.
Why is it we so naturally say Parthenon marbles and then Benin bronzes rather than any of the other? Is that because the Nigerians are very good at propaganda? Are they much more interesting objects?
That's because they've become shorthands for two rather different sorts of shorthand for different types of acquisition, actually. And I think the BM is guilty of somehow capitalising on those shorthand. I'm guilty, but I would be utterly with you on that this is not all it is. I mean, I think the difficulty is, how do you decide who owns these? Now, one perfectly decent answer is to say, it's not an answer I feel totally comfortable with, that Greece sort of owns the Parthenon marbles. Now, we all know what the arguments for that position are, and we know what the arguments against. That it's very different from an equally plausible position, which is what something like Kwame Anthony Appiah would espouse, which is to say that these are objects which are internationally, they belong to humanity, not to one particular bit of it, even if they once made it or once used it. And that is where we start to move apart, because the argument about preservation is fine if you take an internationalist argument. If this object belongs to everybody, then we all have a duty to ensure its good care. If it belongs to this country here, and let's say, for the sake of argument, Britain stole it, then I don't see that you can say, if we give it back to you, you've got to treat it nicely. It would be like saying to somebody, look, I did steal your raincoat, but it wasn't very well looked after, and I will give it back to you, but you've got to promise you'll take it to the dry cleaners every 2 months, right? Now, that makes perfect sense, that sort of argument, if we think we have worldwide communal responsibility for these things. If we think that these are, and increasingly in UNESCO terms, these are owned by the nation state in which they were once made or happened to be buried, that argument then is quite differently skewed, and we can't resolve the problem of who owns them.
David, I don't suppose that Italy has the same kind of claim on Michelangelo, for instance, as we might think states in West Africa might have on some of those objects that are here now in Britain. Does it matter who an object was actually originally made for? I don't imagine that Michelangelo was sculpting, well, he was sculpting for Florentine dukes, I suppose, but he wouldn't have felt this was for Italy.
No, he would have felt it was for the client who was paying him a rather large money to do it in an age of patrons. He wouldn't have imagined that there'd be public access to these objects, to these works of art, because that's not the thinking of the time, as Munira said. But I think we've quite quickly, in this debate, started hitting upon, I think, what are a series of fallacies. The first fallacy is that the law was invented yesterday. Pillage was a crime in the 19th century. The stripping of objects from Benin, the stealing of objects in the 1860s from Abyssinia, were recognised as crimes at the time. There's a historical pattern here, which I think reflects how we think about objects, which is that there's always been two sets of rules. There's a set of conventions and laws that existed within Europe, and Europeans didn't apply those rules of war to colonial people, to non-white people, non-Europeans people. We called them in the 19th century small wars. There was a book written about how they could be conducted. The idea that the rules didn't really apply outside of Europe, I think, is one of the reasons why we have a different relationship with objects. I mean, the two great examples of restitution would be, and the British were absolutely at the centre of this, is the demand that was pushed through, not entirely successfully, but the demand made by the victorious Allies at Vienna in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that demanded that Napoleon, who had looted Spain, looted the Low Countries, looted Italy, and the Italian states in particular, return those objects. The one nation that didn't. France, it was not complete, and there's still objects that are contested. The other example would be 1945. Russia refused, but there was a demand that, as Munira said, that the objects taken by the Nazis were recognised as objects that had been looted. Now, that's not a new idea. The other idea is that no one could see this at the time. When the Parthenon marbles were brought to London, Lord Byron described Lord Elgin as a looter. He described the taking of those objects as a violation. When the objects of Abyssinia, the goods of King Tewodos II were taken, the people who spoke up and said they should be returned include Lord Napier, one of the most infamous colonial soldiers, and William Gladstone, who was the inheritor of the wealthiest slave-owning family in Britain. So they were people of the time, viewing those objects and the ways they were seized through the standards of their time, who felt that they should be returned. So what the argument I'm trying to make is that there's a presumption. Well, two presumptions. One is that people are saying everything should go back, and I've never met anyone who says that. The other is that these ideas, this discomfort with how these objects arrived in museums, is a recent phenomenon, and it just isn't.
Discomfort, of course, is a different thing from proposing restitution.
Gladstone proposed. Gladstone used the word restore about the objects taken from the Abyssinian court in 1863.
He was worried. He became worried when he discovered, when it became very obvious to him, that what was being taken were Christian objects.
It was.
And so they were walking this tightrope.
Yeah.
And actually the tightrope between pagan cult and the objects of Christianity proved too much for Gladstone to stomach. I think you're absolutely right. We do tend to imagine that we're the first people to have thought, oh, maybe this isn't a very good idea. But Roman looting was criticised by Romans.
Yeah.
It's not that looting has always been, oh, that's fine, that's what you do.
Exactly.
But
it's
they
not
are
a new idea.
The precise definition of what it is that you feel uncomfortable about isn't quite so obvious.
Can I pick up on one other fallacy, though? Because I think it's a really important fallacy. It's this idea that museums are going to be emptied. These questions, these requests, these conversations are about a tiny, tiny fraction of the collections of museums. And the other reality about museums that we don't often talk about is that their great problem is not the risk of empty shelves. Their great problem is that they are groaning under the weight of historic overcollection. This museum owns 8 million objects and around 80,000 are on display. The National History Museum in London, 95% of its collection is in storage. The National Maritime Museum, 93%. Tate Britain, 80%. The Louvre has 500,000 objects, 35,000 are on display. Museum de Quai Branly has 69,000 African objects, 1,000 are on display. This idea, the repeated fallacy that this process is going to empty museums, it just doesn't stand up to any...
Munira.
Just on that point, I mean, just because objects aren't on display, it doesn't mean that they're not being used or being researched or being available.
I said that the scale of these collections is far bigger than what's on display.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I think there's still an argument that they are preserved as collections by museums where they can be made accessible to the public, to researchers, where they're kept in safe conditions, because sometimes they are, for example, very large number of the objects in the British Museum collection need to be kept in conditions of darkness, or they've got light sensitivity, and it's very expensive to store those objects as well. Yeah, but it's very expensive to run those museums, and therefore, but that's why they're not on display as well.
No, but they're not just on display. I mean, collections need to be rotated for all sorts of reasons. They're not on display because this museum would take over most of London.
Just a word of defence for Elgin, Lord Elgin, and the removal of objects from places. I agree that there were often motives of greed, of vainglory. You can definitely see that in some of the looting that took place. But in the case of Elgin and a number of other archaeologists and people who went out to places as part of the kind of imperial drive, Elgin was removing objects that were at very high risk of being destroyed. So, the Parthenon was being used by the Ottomans as a gunpowder magazine. So it already experienced one significant explosion. Elgin saw that a lot of these objects were being damaged and therefore removed them. It was very controversial at the time, but I think that there are many people now who would argue that had he not removed them, more of those marbles would have been looted or destroyed.
Rory.
And half of the marbles remain in Athens, not actually on the site, but in a museum not that far away. But I think that is the kind of pragmatic compromise, that you can see the marbles in the context of a universal museum as part of a broader international influence, and you can see them in their locality where they tell a local story, and that kind of pragmatic compromise, I think, makes sense.
I'm still very interested in this question of what objects get in lights from which country. Why is it we always talk about the Benin bronzes? I'm slightly sort of puzzled by this. They don't seem to be very interesting. They're not obvious treasures to me compared to 10,000 other treasures in the museum. But we all talk about the Benin bronzes, and that must be...
They are rather marvellous.
Well, I disagree. I disagree. So I think what happens is sometimes it's about how they're acquired. In the case of Benin bronzes, they're nicked. Sometimes it's because they're things that are part of the myth of a nation. So Athens is very arranged around the Parthenon. But these things change over time. So, the Scots can get very excited about getting the Stone of Destiny back. The Cumbrians might at some point get very excited about getting some of the stone crosses here, but that's all to do with the way in which Cumbrians discover themselves. Does anybody tell them about the objects? Do Afghans know what's in the British Museum? Do people from Tajikistan know what's in the British Museum? If they do, which of the objects in the British Museum are likely to excite them or not? And a lot of that is very, very accidental, contingent. It's not that there's a clear objective process where here are the obvious treasures of the world, and obviously these things should be returned. It's very accidental which countries, which objects happen to dominate these. Final thought from me, performance. The argument about the things that museums do comes down to how well they do it a great deal. Much as actually, although we talk about democracy as a wonderful symbol of equality, we judge democracies on how they perform. How do they run our health service? How do they run our trains, right? So the question for a museum is, how good is it actually at looking after objects, or do those objects go missing, right? How good is the museum about conserving objects, or do they do strange things to marbles which actually corrode them over time? How good is the museum at displaying objects? This is where I tend to agree with David. Have they got an enormous amount locked up? And when they're displaying them, how well do they display them? Is it interesting? Are they explaining them well? Or is it a pretty dull thing that a bunch of school children trudge around in a dutiful fashion, but nobody gets very excited by? The real way that we will make the Met, the Louvre, the British Museum continue to validate themselves is by being extraordinary performers.
Munira.
I would make a slightly different argument about lending or sharing objects with Africa. I think Africa is There was a study by a couple of French academics which said that 90% of all African art is not available in Africa. It's in European and American museums. And I think you can make a very legitimate case for wanting to share more of African art and African cultural heritage in Africa. I think it's very hard to defend that amount of African art not being available to people of Africa. And therefore, the museums, the British Museum and others, I think do have a duty to want to help and develop and build institutions in Africa, to loan objects, to develop partnerships. The British Museum does a lot of lending, does a lot of training of curators. I think that is absolutely a moral imperative for museums in the West. So I don't want to give the impression that I don't think the British Museum has any responsibility to the rest of the world. It's, by the way, one of the reasons why I think the British Museum should keep its entrance free for everybody. It was part of the original legislation. It was part of Hans Sloane's original wish that it would be available not just to people of Britain, but to people internationally. We are guardians of these objects. I don't think they belong to Britain. I think they belong to the world. We happen to be lucky to be hosting them. It's an honour to host these objects. And we have a duty to make sure that they are seen by as many people as possible.
Could I take up what David and Rory have said and also a bit of Munira? Because what you came out with, David, both of you, was not exactly a fallacy, but it was, it gave, I think, a misleading impression, which I wouldn't want people to go away with. Everybody always says, do you know, there's 8 million objects in the British Museum and only X thousand on display. Now, we've got some people in the audience who'll be able to give us figures that are would be much better than mine, but exempli gratia, 4 million of those are under 1 inch in diameter. We're not dealing with loads and loads of Parthenon marbles kind of locked away. We're dealing with bags of boring Romano British pottery, right? And sorry if anybody loves Romano British pottery, but it's not even complete pots, it's about that big. And Mark Jones always used to say there's 500,000 cigarette cards, which I don't believe can possibly be true, but I think it gets, don't imagine that there's an Aladdin's cave in the basement.
But the minority of Benin bronzes in the world are on display. The minority, the majority of them, the biggest collection, is in storage.
I am not saying that I don't, in a sense, go the direction you're going, but I think I wouldn't want people to come away with the wrong impression. But I think that what Munira's saying is really pointing towards the future, because if you take the line that this is not British. We are custodians of this for everybody. This is an international. We're not trying to be nationalistic about it. Then I think if we're talking about the future now, surely we have to say, what is a museum of and for the world in the future? And 30 years ago, that seemed kind of quite easy to decide. It was a nice big building in Bloomsbury, which you got in free, and there were good maps, and everybody could come. And the school children actually, Rory, have a wonderful time. Can come along at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning, and all in their little high-vis jackets, they're really, really enjoying themselves. But I promise, darling.
7-year-old. I can assure you that's not always true.
If it were, yeah, I know. I'm not going to. I'm not having a wet blanket poured.
They always love the mummies, though, don't they? Yeah, that's the thing.
Yes, my first visit here.
Here we are.
But I think we have to say, what do we think the museum is for? And that means, if it's for the world, what is the museum? And can we actually get away from this idea that it's a great temple in Bloomsbury, where if you're lucky enough to be able to pay for your airfare and get a visa from Sudan, you can come and see. Now, we have to be thinking about a world in which we share things differently. That might be partly digitally, but it might also be really. We might be a little less kind of worried about shoving some things in a plane and sending them off for 2 years in Uzbekistan or whatever. We might actually think that people taking expensive airfares and coming through the door from all over the world might not be what we want for this museum, that we want Bloomsbury here to be the capital of the lending library, that is the British Museum. And in the end, I know this is the privilege of the owner, but in the end, I don't give a stuff about ownership, actually. What I really want to find out and to get sorted is who can see this stuff.
Right. Now, Mary has set out what, in her view, we might do and what changes might be made if we see the British Museum as a universal museum. And I'd like to ask each of the other three, what are we getting wrong and what could we get more right? For instance, here in Britain at the British Museum, if we want it to be seen as we believe it to be, a universal museum. Munira, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I've already said I think the British Museum is already very good at lending objects, supporting the curating profession around the world. I mean, I have a slightly different point. I don't know if it relates to your question, Matthew.
Go ahead.
Which is, I do think that museums in Britain tend to be strangely Eurocentric in one way, not in the way that we often use that word, which is I don't think we talk enough about other empires. I mean, the British Empire was one empire that existed at that time. The Ottoman Empire also existed. Slavery went east as well as west. But if you look at the British Museum website, there's not very much mention of that. If you go to, you know, I spent a bit of time at the on the website looking at the page about the Benin bronzes. There's not a huge amount of mention about the fact that the Kingdom of Benin was at the centre of the slave trade in Africa. And I think you have to look at Britain in the context of its time and other ways in which the world was operating. The fact that slavery was the norm. And it's not to justify or defend what Britain did in the particularities of the transatlantic slave trade, but I think it provides context, which sometimes is strangely missing from our museums. And I think that would be a really fruitful thing to develop. You know, we talk about the importance of widening our international perspective. But I don't think we talk enough about, the 15 or 17 million people that were transported across the Sahara Desert in very inhumane conditions and for a much longer period over several centuries before the transatlantic slave trade started. So if we want to be a genuinely universal museum and we want our museums to really explore the history of the world, I think we should stop thinking that the British Empire was the only empire at that time.
You've made your point. Effectively. But I would like to move back to the question of how might the British Museum reconsider some of the things that it does if it is to be the universal museum that it hopes. What do you think, David?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I made a program when I was 28 years old about the Eastern slave trade. Anyone who reads a book will understand that the world empire is a more normal state of organisation than the nation state. It's much older. No one's ever said that the British Empire is unique. The most, I think, obvious thing about the British Empire is it's no different to any other empire. I think anyone who reads a history book would get that. To kind of try to move things forwards, I think as Mary said, the museum has got to be less of a building in Bloomsbury and more of a library. But I do think we need to recognise that some objects mean things to other people that they cannot mean to us, and that they cannot express that meaning inside a museum. There are objects held in Western museums that indigenous people regard as deities. They regard them as being imprisoned. They regard them as living things with the much legitimacy as a human being. That will never be apparent to us. There are objects that I will never feel for them, what another person from another tradition will feel. And when we talk about decolonisation, it's partly about being aware of that. And I do think this comes back to the Parthenon marbles. They mean something to Greece that I think supersedes our right to imprison them in this building. I also have to pick up on this idea of safety. First of all, 3 British museums were destroyed in the Second World War, Hull, Liverpool, and the Hunterian Museum. So we're not quite as safe as we pretend. But the idea that the Elgin marbles have been kept safe, they were damaged on removal, they were sawn from their plinth, some of them were sawn in half, they were damaged in transit, one of the ships carrying them actually sank, and they had to be recovered by divers. They were damaged by the pollution of Victorian London, they were damaged by a cleaning attempt in 1858, they were damaged more controversially by another disastrous cleaning attempt in 1938. In 1961, 2 schoolboys knocked the leg off one of the statues, and famously the roof leaked a few years ago, which was probably the biggest day Twitter has ever had in Greece. I think we exaggerate this idea that other people cannot look after their own heritage, but also we misunderstand that some things are to other people, they have meanings that we just can't appreciate.
Rory.
Well, I think the British Museum does an extraordinary job, and I think it's got a really tough job. And I think one of the problems is money. So there's lots of things that I'd love the British Museum to do, which they don't have the cash to do. I'd love them to completely reimagine their Egyptian and Greek galleries. I'd love them to present the Parthenon marbles in a completely different way, but they're worrying presumably about how they sort out, I don't know, their sewerage or their wiring or their £1 billion problem with trying to sort out whatever they're doing. Again, I would love to feel that we could look at being much more dynamic about putting things back into the landscape. As an MP for Hadrian's Wall, one of the saddest things is the way that those Roman forts are completely denuded. It's not just the British Museum, the Newcastle Museum, for goodness sake, has stripped half these forts. So you plod along, you turn up in these places, and they basically look like empty football pitches. And if you're lucky, there's some faded sign telling you there was once a statue of Zeus found here or something else that's been dragged off. Now, of course, the response, presumably from the curator at the British Museum or the Newcastle Museum, is that it would be jolly expensive to put it back. So I would love us to look at replicas. Why don't we put a really interesting replica of all those statues we've nicked from the forts along Hadrian's Wall back in the positions in which they were found on Hadrian's Wall? I also slightly agree with David that the whole place feels to me, but again, this is a funding issue because redoing these galleries is a problem, too crowded. They're showing too much. They're showing too many examples of each thing. Go up to the Chinese gallery for my money, right? I'm now getting a bit snooty here. I think that the National Museum in Taipei represents blue and white Xuande Ming Dynasty porcelain far better than the British Museum because it shows far more examples of Xuande Ming Dynasty porcelain. I think museums that attempt to show one blue and white pot, one example of Famille Rose, one example of Famille Vert, one bronze, are not really doing anything very interesting. But this brings me to my final point. The question is, who's the audience? Right? Who does this thing exist for? And this is the problem that the British Museum's struggling with. It's got to deal with my son turning up, age 7, in his high-vis vest. It's got to deal with Mary. It's got to deal with me. It's got to deal with her friend from Sudan who's just turned up and wants to bring the stuff back to Sudan. These are very, very difficult, different types of audience. And I think it would be really helpful but really challenging for the museum to narrow its focus and narrow the kind of person it's trying to address. Part of the problem being a universal museum is trying to be everything to everyone.
We have 4 minutes left before we throw the discussion open to our audience. Perhaps 1 minute each maximum on this, but I'd just finally like to talk about scholarship. Is a universal museum the best thing for scholars? Is it most convenient? Is it easiest if you're pursuing scholarship to have everything in one place? Does it make any difference to a scholar, Mary?
Well, yes, but I don't think it's what drives me. I mean, I think it's interesting that Rory's point about Hadrian's Wall, because most claims for restitution are not international claims for restitution at all. They're claims, national claims, where we want something from X museum to go back to where it came from, usually in the north. So, sorry, that's for George. I think that for me what's really important is the foregrounding of scholarship. I think, look, the British Museum is well set up, you can't complain. The important thing for me is that, that scholarship should be seen to be at the heart of what the museum does. I mean, all the people who people don't often see, when they come to the museum, they are there making a difference to how those objects mean for everybody from every part of the world and of the country. And I think that's really important. And I tend to get slightly uneasy, as I think some people here in the room know, when we start to think about museum as a place to discover yourself. I think the museum is not a place to discover yourself. You find out what you're not, and you learn about the expertise that opens up the past. And if we go into kind of fuzzy stuff about, can I see myself in the museum? No, you can't, but you can learn something.
Munira.
So very quickly, I think one of the sort of invisible aspects to museums is the fact that they are often involved in international digs and international studies. So I'm a card-carrying member of the Natural History Museum. They're very involved in research all around the world, often related to conservation and environmental protection, which is fantastic. But that's an important part of what museums do as well. They are academic institutions. The second thing I would say is that museums can do a lot to digitize their collections and to make them accessible to the public. So in a previous life, I was involved in setting up a website that told stories about objects in museums, and we filmed in the British Museum. It's called Henny Talks. You can see it's all free, short videos about objects. And I think there's more we can do to bring these objects to life, to explain where they come from, why they're beautiful, get curators in front of cameras. There's no reason why we can't do that now. The technology exists.
David.
I think this takes me back to the thing I said at the beginning, which is that there's a dark side to the history that we've not wanted to talk about because we haven't wanted to talk about imperialism. There's absolutely no doubt that the Universal Museum has been one of the great engines of scholarship and of knowledge about human civilizations. But museums all over the world, much less so universal museums, I have to say, are also filled with millions of objects of human beings, of human remains. They're there because museums were also the great engines of the development of racial science. The raw material of racial science were these millions of human body parts gathered from all over the world, and now an enormous problem, a huge moral problem for museums. So absolutely, it's yes and both. Of course, the scholarship, of course, what we've learnt about human civilizations, but there's also, and there always is, another side to it, and we've not wanted to talk about it. And now we find our museum vaults full of this toxic human remains, these legacies of horrific events in our past. And it's forcing us to have a conversation about that other aspect of scholarship in museums.
It seems, Rory, you get the last word.
Well, quick last word. One thing that is very striking is fashion again. How things that scholars were really interested in the past, people aren't really interested in now. Let me take an example. Arms and armour. There are very, very few curators now in any of these museums really focused on this. The last great curator of Japanese armour retired at the Victoria and Albert Museum. The last great curator of armour at the Wallace Collection retired. These museums have enormous collections of things called tsubas, which are the hilts of Japanese swords, the sword guard, beautifully decorated, collected in their thousands by Victorian collectors. They're sitting on, some of them are sitting on 2,000 or 3,000 of these things, never seen. They don't even put them in drawers that you can pull them out on. You have to request them one by one. And although we tell ourselves big stories about how wonderful the scholarship is, and again, this may be a question of academic fashion, it may be a question of resources, it's very difficult now in any of these museums to find anybody who can talk with fluent authority about these objects, and they don't publish. The only book available on the subject comes out of a single collection from the Fine Art Museum in Boston. So one of the issues that we're dealing with, I'm just trying to use that as a very narrow example, but we talk about scholarship in museums as though we know everything about all these objects, are publishing about them all the time, whereas in fact the knowledge in the museum is much frailer, much more partial and much less published than we want to acknowledge.
Thank you. Now, questions both from the floor, and we have a virtual audience who are sending questions to me too. But let's start from the floor. I think, Simon Jenkins, did you have a question you were going to ask?
No.
Oh.
If you want me to ask one,
I've been misinformed, but go ahead.
No, I'm always intrigued by hearing very intelligent people discussing something in a way in which they are rephrasing a question. And the world of museums is one great question to me. What fascinates me is that sometimes they come up with answers which other people don't like. The British Museum got a great question about whether you send back the Parthenon marbles. No one's answered it. I'd love to know if the 4 people on the platform would send them back or not.
Well, let's have a yes or no. Mary.
Oh, I can't do a yes or no answer. I'm an academic.
You can have 2 sentences.
I can have, well, a minute. I think we should get away from the way that Simon has just phrased that question. Is it going back or is it staying here? It's, it makes the poor old marbles into a child in a messy divorce case. All right? I want to see those marbles shared, I think, realistically, more generously with Greece. I don't think there are many people who object to that, but I want them shared with the world. That's where the international argument comes in. I want to see, one piece of the pediment was sent to St. Petersburg many decades ago. I would like to see, again, the Parthenon marbles being ambassadors for a particular sort of Hellenic classical culture in which both Greece and the United Kingdom and many other countries in the world share. And they can do their job, and not just in Athens or London. What about Beijing?
Rory.
I guess if I'm really held against the wall, I probably think in the end they probably should go back, yeah.
David.
It's 8 years away from the bicentenary of them arriving in this museum, quite controversially. We're 9 years away from 200 years since Greece first asked for these objects to be returned. 200 years. I think the case is overwhelming that they are an essential part of the culture of Greece, and they belong in the beautiful museum that the Greeks have built in anticipation of receiving them.
Sorry, just weird things. Having been dragged by Simon into confessing my views on the Elgin marbles, one of the things I've always thought is a bit weird about them is that one of the arguments was that the horrible thing that Elgin did was to remove them from the temple. But the Greeks are not proposing to put them back on the temple. They're proposing to agree with Elgin and think they should be in a museum so we can stare at them. Why are they not proposing to stick them back on the temple?
I think it's because of the pollution in Athens.
Right. Now, I'd like one more question from the floor here, and then we'll go over to our virtual audience. There's somebody with a mic. Can I see a hand up anywhere? What about the gentleman straight in front of me in glasses and a blue sweater, I think? Hard to get the mic to him, but it might be possible.
Thank you. Excellent debate. One of the things particularly mentioned was using modern technology and digitizing things so that more people can experience them wherever they are. I'd be interested in your view as to how realistic that is, both from a scholar's point of view and from just a general humanity point of view. It's fascinating that we think that would be great, and I've seen many wonderful examples of virtual reality experiences in museums that really bring things to life fantastically. And yet, we were told this evening that some of us might end up watching this debate in a nearby room on a screen. So we all queued desperately because we wanted to be here in person. How similar is it?
I'd like to combine that question with a question we have from our virtual audience. As it is possible to replicate many items to an exacting standard, e.g. 3D printing, and the ability to view in virtual reality, why is the original held on to? So both those questions, they are essentially the same question. Mary?
This is where I'm going to show myself up as an old-fashioned romantic. I think that digital technology has a huge part to play. I really do. I'm not knocking that in any way. I think that if what you want to do is confront the past, you don't do it with a bit of 3D printing. You confront the past because you're seeing the real wow factor, wondrous thing in front of your very eyes. And one person who was a trustee until quite recently asked what she thought the BM slogan should be. And she said, it's a wonderful museum full of real things. And I think there is an increasing interest and fashionability in the authentic above the digital recon, although that has its place. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't confronted the real thing.
David, if we reach a world, which we may, where 3D printing can make something almost indistinguishable from the real thing, where most of the visitors to a museum really won't know whether it's the real thing or the replica, why does it matter that it's the real thing?
I don't know, but it just does. As Mary said, and maybe this is the two historians on the panel, there is something about authenticity, there is something about touching, being near the object that was involved in those moments. I mean, the most, to me, astonishing work of art in this museum is the double-headed serpent. It might have been there at the moment when Cortes encountered Moctezuma. It's astonishing to be in its proximity. I think the thing about online and digital, I think that is not going to go anywhere near addressing the issue of ownership, pillage and looting. No. If I stole your car and emailed you a VR link to it, I don't think that would sort things out between us.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Munira, yeah.
I agree. It's not the same as seeing the object in real life. It's just it's a different experience. But you can also, through, for example, Mary and David have produced fantastic TV documentaries about artworks and objects from around the world, and it is just another way of enhancing the accessibility of these things. But I always tell the story of in the Museum of London, which is going to be reopening soon in an entirely new building. They have a brick from the fire of London, and it still smells of the smoke. And I think that is magical. That sense of the real is something that museums can do that's incredibly unique.
But I think we can also be a bit snobby, because I think that actually reproductions are so much more accessible. I mean, there's actually a real problem of just how many people can get to an object. If you go and peer at the Mona Lisa, you begin to see the limits possible for a single object to be seen by people, right? And I think that the fact that most people involved in museums are very concerned about authenticity prevents them from really engaging with an audience that would often like to handle things much more. What we tend to do, if you go around I don't know, a normal exhibition on the Roman army, you'll have a few little bits that kids can put on, maybe a helmet or a bit of thing, right? We could be doing so much more to use replicas and 3D printing to actually let people handle things. We should have, and not just 3D printing, we should get a lot of Mary's stuff, these old Romano British pots or the coins out. Leather shoes. Winterlander does a lot on this. Winterlander has huge walls of leather shoes and stuff. Yeah.
Let them handle real things.
Yes.
We've kind of come to the view that somehow, in order for it to be handled, it has to be a fake. Well, actually, they can, with some exceptions, people can handle Greek pots. If one gets broken, it's sad, but there's lots more where that came from.
But I agree with you. But why don't we?
A real Twitter school now.
No, but I agree. But why don't we do it? Yeah. I mean, I don't experience this very much in museums. I think everything is very, very precious, like a library where you're not allowed to take any books out.
Yeah. Right.
I would say one thing in defence of replicas and reproductions. They certainly have a power, because every time I come to this museum, I have to drag myself out of the gift shop with money left on my account. If I was allowed in there unattended, I'd bankrupt myself in a minute. So they certainly have a power.
Question now from our virtual audience. How many people would be able to see the Benin bronzes and other cultural items if they were returned to Nigeria? I understand the sensitivities of the situation, but isn't the history and the culture of Benin best served by being viewed by a global audience that the British Museum enables? Start with that one, David.
We think there's between 3,000 and 4,000 objects taken from the destruction of the Royal Palace in Benin, one extraordinarily violent moment in British history. I've never met any Nigerian, and I'm half Nigerian, I was born in Lagos, who wants all of them returned to Nigeria. Just as I would hate to think all of the wonderful creative and cultural output of Britain would all be gathered on these islands. It's wonderful to be in Boston or to be in the Rijksmuseum and see works of British art. The problem is there's hardly any in Nigeria. That's been the problem. Nigeria, from the moment of independence, requested a return of some of them. It is the most solvable of almost all of these issues because there's thousands of them.
By the way, I'm in favour of returning or sharing the new bronzes with
yes.
Nigeria, but a number of them were gifted away. And we have to be confident that when they're returned, they don't go into a private collection. And those are the conditions, I think, that we...
Absolutely. I'm not sure there's conditions.
Let's now go back to our audience. Who else would like... Shoshana.
Thank you. I have a question about the universal nature of this and other museums, not just in geography, but in time. Obviously, we have these things that are called museums of contemporary art, but I work with traditional artisans across Afghanistan, Myanmar, the Middle East. They have more in common with these objects, and their inheritance is more connected to these. So I'm interested in whether anyone thinks there's more that can be done with connecting to those living traditions. And it's not just a technical point about whether now is interesting, but also about the point of what a universal museum does in terms of access, interaction, living traditions. Do we do more? What could we do more? Then more would be my question.
Very unfairly, this is Shoshana is my wife, so
declare
but I would I'd start maybe just by saying that there's one of the really interesting things you've got to there is the making of these objects, and the connection between craftspeople and the objects themselves. Probably one of the most powerful things, to return to the subject of subas, which are these sort of handguards on swords that you can see in the Victoria and Albert Museum, is a contemporary craftsman making a suba. And I do feel that Smithsonian in Washington did this. We could be doing much, much more to bring alive the way in which these objects were made by highly skilled craftspeople being available either on video or in person to interact with those objects and present them. Yeah.
You talk about swords at breakfast, you two.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, now we have a virtual question here. We may have different views in 50 years' time than those we had 50 years ago. Should not this be part of the discussion? It's a good point. Why is now the moment, so to speak, to freeze and decide what's right? And are we aware that our successors may have different opinions? David?
I don't think now is a moment when we're turning a corner. I think now is a moment when conversations that didn't happen about the nature of museums and the nature of how things were collected are being had. And I think it's part of a continuum. We're having a discussion. That discussion will never reach a conclusion. Objects will move around the world. The rights of where objects should be, as Mary said, most of these debates are within countries. I'm from, was brought up in Newcastle. The demand that the Science Museum relinquish Leif Stephenson's rocket is one that I learned when I was about 10. So I don't think now is the terminus of debate. I think it's a moment within the debate.
And it's museums have always debated these things. It's not just that we've suddenly woken up. We've woken up to different aspects about the museum's history. But there's always been conflict about what should be in the museum, who should look at it, etc., etc. And I think it's part, the museum would be dead if we weren't having a discussion like this. And we said, look, the British Museum, it perfectly represents humanity as we now know it. We might as well, lock the door and go home.
Munira?
I think something has changed in the last 20 or so years, which is there's much more political pressure, both outside the museum and inside, to return objects. And whilst that's understandable on one level, I think the risk is that museum trustees and leaders feel that that pressure is too difficult to withstand and therefore make very quick decisions under that pressure. And as I was saying earlier, I think museums are custodians of objects. They have a primary duty to ensure that heritage is protected and preserved. And my worry is that sometimes in the kind of rush to want to please lots of stakeholders, to be seen to be doing the right thing, long term you may end up potentially damaging that heritage. So that's I think something that has changed, that pressure has built.
Although objects were being returned from this museum to different owners 125, 130 years ago.
And thousands of objects were returned across Europe after 1815.
Yeah,
thousands were returned after the First World War. The Ghent altarpiece was moved back and forth across Europe.
And
again after 1945. This is not new.
Let's have a question now from the floor, somewhere towards the back. Yes, I see a hand up there in front of the cameras. If someone could get a mic over to that person.
I know the British Museum and lots of other kind of national museums do lots of outreach work, lots of digital stuff. Loads of them have amazing TikTok channels and all that kind of thing. And they do have exhibitions around the country. But my instinct is that it all seems to be still very London-centric. And we have these places called the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery. Do you think it should be, it feels very London-centric? I mean, I don't know if it plays much of a role for people in villages in the countryside. Do you think it should expand out more, do more to feed that? Or do you think it should be a London thing?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I'm involved in the Crieff Museum, which is a museum in a small town in Scotland, where we're very cross that the Perth Museum, that's a slightly larger museum in a town of Scotland, is not giving objects back to the Crieff Museum, and Perth is cross that Edinburgh is not giving them stuff. I mean, I think it's a good dynamic. I mean, but there's many things we have to think about. One of them is that if we moved all the treasures out of the Edinburgh Museum back to every town they came from, you'd have to make much more effort and have to be much more serious about seeing all those objects than if you went to visit them in one place. I think the second question is the question just about money and conservation. I mean, again, the problem with the Crieff Museum is that we struggle to finance it, we struggle to look after these objects, we struggle to pay someone even to man the door. And I think the other thing is being serious about who goes to see them. I have spent a lot of my time living in countries in which, in my observation, and I don't want to be sort of pick out countries, but I can name half a dozen countries where when you turn up in the great museum in the capital city, most of the people walking around it are a bunch of tourists on a tour guide. Yes. It's not that the locals are absolutely desperate to see their culture again and that the street children are all in there sketching like some young Anthony Gormley taking inspiration of the thing. It's a bunch of people from Newcastle who are on a tour guide.
But the British Museum already does this very successfully. I think one of the best initiatives that's been going on for 20 years or so now is the BM's partnership galleries with local museums around the country. And it took a decision long before my time that it wasn't going to build a great British Museum North. But what it does is sponsors galleries and loans objects on a long-term basis to museums in Glasgow, in Norwich, in Shrewsbury is coming up. So if you go on the website, and it's a bit hidden, I'm afraid, and you put in the search partnership galleries, you'll find museums throughout the country that are displaying objects which are technically BM objects, but in newly refitted galleries. And often those BM objects are meant to complement the kind of collections that they've already got. And I think it's probably partly the British Museum's fault, in a way, that not many people know how successful this has been or that it even exists. But it's bloody good, actually.
I totally agree with Mary. I think there's a lot of brilliant thinking and innovations going on globally in the world of curatorship. I was recently in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, feeling guilty I was going home having not been to the Rijksmuseum, and there's a beautiful display within the airport.
I want the Heathrow BM.
Yeah, exactly.
And don't go to Derby without visiting the Derby Museum and Gallery, which has the finest collection of Joseph Wright of Derby paintings in the world, and the Museum of Making, because Derbyshire was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. There is a place for those locally based. Right, one more perhaps from the audience. Yes, there's a hand up there. Yes, about 4 rows back from the front. Keep your hand up, sir. Yes, yes, the mic's coming your way.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. Can I just ask, what do you have a favourite museum?
The British Museum. And that was true before I became a trustee. Right?
The second favourite?
The Soane Museum.
Munira?
It's impossible to choose. I'm a real museums junkie. Actually, I would go for the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. It was the closest thing I had to a spiritual experience in a museum.
Yes.
It's a museum of world art, obviously fairly new, collections, artworks from all around the world. It's beautifully told. It's a very small collection. Everything is on display. And it shows that the Universal Museum is not just a Western concept. It's been exported to great effect.
Mine changes constantly. At the moment, it's the Flanders Field Museum in Ypres, which is in the beautiful cloth hall that was destroyed in the First World War. First World War was one of my specialisms, and it's brilliantly innovative, using audio and video to talk about what happened to this tiny part of Belgium when the First World War just arrived in that beautiful town.
I love the museum and the citadel in Amman. Hasn't been changed since about 1936. Tiny little labels, dusty glass cases, but a wonderfully comprehensive collection of what's been dug up in the citadel, beautifully presented to adults.
We haven't much time left, and there's one question again from our virtual audience, which takes us right back to the subject that we've been talking about this evening, at the heart of it. Who owns the past? Not just from a physical objects perspective, but from a historical perspective. Does the panel consider that any one country, institution, viewpoint can own the past at all? So, Mary, your answer to the question, who owns the past? We haven't actually tried to answer it.
I'm going to slightly deflect, and I'm going to say the present owns the past. The past doesn't have rights. Is something that we do. We communally, present humanity does what we want to do. And I think we are respectful, we are preserving, we have high standards of expertise, but in the end, the past is ours.
So when the Taliban, I think it was the Taliban, blew up all those Buddhas, did they own the past?
Well, the problem is that once you've said, my touchy-feely, we own the past, is fine. But of course, there are then conflicts when we disagree about what we want to do with the past. But it seems to me that is what the past is for. The past is something we should be arguing about in order to help us understand the present. And we construct it and reconstruct it. And it throws light on us as much as it does on them. But it also has, as you can see in this museum, and I've been the beneficiary of, it has that wondrous quality. It's what the Greeks called thauma. It is wonder that makes you change your mind about things. That's what Plato thought, anyway.
I think the past is owned both by individuals or institutions, because there's legal ownership, but then it's also owned by humanity. It's a universal phenomenon, and you have to be able to hold both ideas in your head at the same time. And that's why I would defend keeping the Elgin marbles in London and the Parthenon marbles in Athens, because I think it exemplifies that dialectic, to use a phrase.
Rory.
I think the question of who owns is very strange, because let's take the Koh-i-Noor. this thing is brought by the Emperor Babur, who's a guy who comes originally from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan. He passes it on to its grandchildren. It gets nicked back to Iran. It gets nicked to Afghanistan. It gets back to Punjab. It gets to Queen Victoria. And India claims it as a nation. What's the relationship between these particular monarchs who mine or buy a diamond and a nation which they wouldn't recognize 500 years later? So my sense is it isn't about ownership. It's really about performance. It's about what you do with it. And that is about enacting your obligation to people who are dead and people who are not yet born.
David, is it possible to argue that nobody owns the past? All the past is the truth, the present is the truth, and the future will be the truth, and nobody owns the truth?
Well, I mean, we don't own the past because we're not going to be here for that long, sadly. I think the great problem is that the Universal Museum is one of the greatest concepts to come out of the Enlightenment. It's one of the greatest achievements of humanity, but it's not universal enough. For historic reasons that we all understand, too much of the world's cultural heritage is separated from people as ancestors who made it, who's hoarded in a small number of countries. And the great mission of the Universal Museum should be to be more universal. The ideas that Mary talked about lending, about getting these goods to circulate around the world as they have done historically, for museums to be engines for that circularity, for us to properly share rather than hoard.
Do you think this museum is on the right track?
I hope so. I'd ask Mary after a drink.
I just want to agree with David. I think that we all know that beneath our fine words, the idea of the Universal Museum has been used as a fig leaf for acquisition. You can't do anything about this museum. You can't have anything back because this is a universal museum. Do you not get that? And I think that people have whoever we is, have used that quite to justify our own acquisitiveness. But I think what we're all saying, in our different ways, whether we talk about it at the present or nobody owns it, is that the past. There's no title to the past. There's a series of discussions and movements and wonderings and furious and frantic arguments, which are all to the good.
Yeah. On that note, I have to wind the discussion up. And before I thank our guests, can I say what a huge privilege it is for me to be here? I went into the reading room and remembered 55 years ago going into the reading room as a raw young undergraduate, and it looks better now than it did even then. So my thanks to the British Museum. My thanks to The Times, my newspaper, who have generously sponsored and helped organise all this, to Mary Beard, to Munira Mirza, to David Olusoga and to Rory Stewart, and to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so much for chairing that discussion so brilliantly, and to all of the panellists. It's been a really enlightening evening. I think I've been given the task of trying to sum up, which is quite complex, but just some observations that I've scribbled down during the talk. There's been much food for thought. I have to say, Munira, I loved your phrase about human difference, which I think is something for all of us to think about, and also imploring us to remember the radicality of a Universal Museum and how important that was. I'm reminded too that George Osborne, our chair, mentions the Round Reading Room, which of course reopens today, being a place for both Lenin, who studied there, and of course Marx, who spent more than 30 years there every day writing Das Kapital. And I was reading recently that when Gorbachev visited the Round Reading Room in 1984, he said, if people don't like Marxism, they can blame the British Museum. So I want to add that list to our charge sheet of things that we're being blamed about. But David, I think in terms of the opposite view of Munira, where she talks about this Moebius strip between empire and abolition, we do have to remember and acknowledge the darker imperatives that lurks behind all this. I think that's very important. And also too, David and Mary, I loved your discussion around lending and the importance of the British Museum potentially being a lending library for the world. And I love the idea of a universal museum not being universal enough, that it should be more universal. I think that's something for us to think about. And then finally, Rory, I very gladly accept the gauntlet you threw down that museums earn the things that they keep through their reputation and the way that they steward them, the scholarship, and the way that they explain them to audiences. So I hope to keep on convincing you in the years to come. I just want to thank all of you for taking part in a really fantastic and enlightening discussion, which I hope can continue, and of course the Times for hosting. Thank you all for being here. I think now we're encouraged to go upstairs into the Great Court and carry on the discussion over a drink. And of course, if you haven't seen the Round Reading Room, which reopened today, please do so. Thank you very much.